You don't lose yourself all at once. That's the first thing people misunderstand when they come to that crushing realization. I don't recognize who I am anymore. They assume it's some sudden collapse, like the self just vanished into thin air one day. But that's not how it works. It's a slow erosion, a subtle decay, and most dangerously, it happens quietly, in moments that don't feel significant at the time. You compromise once, just a little, to keep the peace. You say yes when your body screams no, because you don't want to seem difficult. You stay silent when you should have spoken up because you tell yourself it's not worth the conflict. And maybe it isn't in that moment, but the moment repeats and the cost compounds. Over time, you start to orient your entire life around what keeps others comfortable, what keeps things stable, what's expected. And all the while, your internal compass, the one that once pointed true north, starts spinning. You don't notice it right away, but one day you wake up and realize you've walked miles in a direction you never intended to go. You've abandoned yourself not in one grand betrayal, but through 1,000 tiny ones. That's the tragedy of it. And also the hope, because if you didn't lose yourself overnight, you don't have to fix it overnight either. The process that slowly dismantled your identity can also be reversed, but it requires brutal honesty and real courage. You have to be willing to trace the steps that got you here, to examine the precise ways you learned to disown who you are. And often it goes back further than we want to admit. Childhood is where many of us first learn that who we are is too much or not enough. We absorb that from the way we're treated, the roles we're cast into, the love that was conditional. Maybe your anger wasn't allowed, so you suppressed it. Maybe your curiosity was dismissed, so you stopped asking. Over and over again, you got the message. Be this, not that. And so you built a self that was acceptable, digestible, pleasing to others, even if it made you sick inside. This false self becomes functional. It gets praised, rewarded, promoted, but eventually it starts to crack because it's not rooted in truth. It's a performance. And performances require energy, an enormous amount of it. That's why people hit burnout not just in work, but in life. Because pretending to be someone you're not is one of the most exhausting things you can do. So what do you do when you realize this? When the weight of that false identity becomes unbearable, you start by recognizing the silent disappearance of your authentic self for what it is. A tragedy, yes, but also a call to action. This isn't about self-pity, it's about self-responsibility. You didn't consciously choose to abandon yourself, but now you can consciously choose to return. And that begins with noticing. Really noticing. Where do you feel resentment? That's a signal. Where do you feel numb? That's a red flag. What parts of your day feel like you're just going through the motions? Those are clues. Because the self, even when buried, doesn't stop speaking. It just whispers instead of shouts. And your job now is to listen. You'll find that some of the things you once tolerated become intolerable. Certain dynamics, certain conversations, certain roles you used to play, they'll suddenly feel misaligned. That's not you becoming difficult. That's you becoming honest. And honesty, while uncomfortable, is how you reestablish your integrity. It's how you build trust with yourself. Again, it's also important to understand that this process won't be linear. You'll take 2 steps forward, then 1 back. There will be days when the old self tries to reclaim its place, out of fear, out of habit. That's normal. You're not failing. You're rewiring decades of psychological conditioning. Be patient, but uncompromising. You're not negotiating anymore. You're rebuilding. There will be loss. That's inevitable. When you stop performing, some people will miss the character you played. They'll push back, accuse you of changing, of being selfish, of having an ego. And you know what? They're right. You are changing. And that's the point. You're reclaiming your right to exist as you are. And you should have an ego, because having a healthy sense of self is not arrogance. It's sanity. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself you created to survive. You owe yourself the chance to thrive as who you actually are. This is the beginning, not of finding some lost artifact called you, but of creating the conditions where the real you can emerge fully, and without apology. And I'll leave you with this. Every time you say yes to something that violates your soul, you lose a piece of yourself. But every time you choose truth over comfort, every time you stand in your values instead of bending to avoid discomfort, you take that piece back. Piece by piece, choice by choice, you rebuild until one day you look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back, not because they look like the old you, but because they finally feel like home. You don't find yourself by looking in the mirror. You find yourself by watching what you do when no one's watching. That's where the truth is. It's not in the curated image, not in the polished version of yourself you present to the world. It's in your behavior, especially in silence. When the masks drop and the distractions fade, the person who emerges in that solitude is who you've become. The strange thing about losing yourself is that the external world often rewards it. Society doesn't necessarily want you to be deeply self-aware. It wants you to be functional, productive, predictable. The world runs smoother that way. But smoother doesn't mean better. It certainly doesn't mean fulfilled. So when you step back and begin the process of rediscovering who you are, one of the first and hardest realizations is this: much of what you called your life was actually a series of automated responses, scripts, learned patterns, expectations passed down or picked up along the way, reinforced by repetition and rewarded by acceptance. And if you look closely, you'll see it in your relationships, your habits, even your beliefs, the way you interact with the people closest to you. How much of that is authentic? How much of that is performance? It's confronting to admit that you might not know yourself as well as you thought, but it's also liberating because it means there's room to learn, to watch, to notice, to study your own patterns like an observer rather than a prisoner of them. The first step in this kind of self-observation is awareness, but not the vague kind of awareness you see on coffee mugs and Instagram quotes. I'm talking about ruthless self-examination, the kind that's uncomfortable, the kind that interrupts the automatic flow of your day and forces you to ask, why did I do that? Why did I say yes to something I didn't want? Why did I laugh when I didn't think it was funny? Why do I feel exhausted after spending time with that person? Those questions matter. They're not overreactions or overthinking. They're signals. And if you ignore them, they become symptoms. Emotional exhaustion, resentment, burnout, anxiety that seems to come from nowhere, depression that feels directionless. But these aren't mysteries. They're the body and psyche trying to deliver a message. You've wandered too far from your own center. So, how do you course correct? You begin by learning to observe without judgment. That's key. Self-awareness without compassion just turns into self-punishment. You don't need more shame, you need clarity. Clarity that says, okay, I've been operating on autopilot, but now I'm awake, now I'm watching. And now I can choose, because choice is everything. That's where the power is. But you can't choose if you don't know what you're doing. And you won't know what you're doing if you're not watching yourself. Start simple, start small. In conversation, ask yourself, am I speaking honestly or am I managing perception? When making a decision, ask, am I doing this from alignment or from fear? When interacting with others, wonder, do I feel safe enough to be myself right now? Or am I adjusting who I am to maintain harmony? This kind of inner dialogue doesn't make you unstable, it makes you awake. Most people drift through their lives in a haze of reaction and assumption. But when you become the kind of person who watches what you do, you start to regain control over your own narrative. You start to rewrite your story in real time. The more you practice this, the more patterns you'll see. And they won't all be easy to face. You might realize you've been people-pleasing to avoid abandonment, or overachieving to feel worthy, or staying silent because you were taught that your voice causes conflict. These are survival strategies. They were learned for a reason, but you're not at the mercy of them anymore. You can upgrade them. And here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. Everything you do teaches you about who you are. If you want to know yourself again, or maybe for the first time, watch your choices, your rituals, your impulses, your reactions. And then ask yourself if those things are building the life you want, or if they're maintaining a life you no longer believe in. Because at some point, you have to decide whether your identity is going to be a reaction to your past or a creation creation of your future. People talk about self-love like it's just positive affirmations and bubble baths, but real self-love is observation. It's saying, I see you to the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. It's making decisions that respect your long-term well-being, not just your short-term comfort. It's watching your own life like it matters, because it does. You don't need to rush to fix everything. You don't need to have all the answers, but you do need to watch, to listen, to reflect. Because in that space between action and reaction is where the true self begins to reemerge. And once you see it, even just a glimpse, you can't unsee it. That's where the real journey starts. Not with a dramatic change, but with a quiet, consistent commitment to paying attention. Because the self isn't something you find out there, it's something you rediscover within. One honest observation at a time. And that right there is the beginning of freedom. You cannot become who you are without confronting who you've been. That's one of those truths we often try to sidestep because it forces us to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. But here's the thing, your past isn't just something that happened to you. It's the soil your identity has grown in. And until you're willing to dig into that soil, you can't pull out the roots that are strangling your potential. Now, that doesn't mean you need to drown in nostalgia or wallow in regret. That's not the point. The point is integration, the process of turning your experiences, especially the ones you'd rather forget, into wisdom, and not abstract feel-good wisdom. I'm talking about the kind that shapes your decisions, the kind that becomes part of your moral structure, your internal compass. That requires work. It requires honesty, brutal, surgical honesty. Many people live with unresolved fragments of themselves, things they've buried so deep they've forgotten they even exist. And those fragments don't just disappear, they leak. They show up as irrational reactions, unexplained fears, subtle self-sabotage. You don't heal by pretending these things aren't there. You heal by letting them surface, slowly, deliberately, and with structure. We are not static beings. We are in constant transformation. But transformation demands confrontation. It demands that you take an honest look at the choices you've made, the ones that hurt you, the ones that hurt others, and even the ones that seemed harmless at the time, but accumulated into patterns that now suffocate you. And one of the biggest traps we fall into is identifying with our wounds, making them into our personality, carrying them like a badge. It's understandable, especially if the pain was deep or if it began in childhood. When your suffering isn't acknowledged by others, you often start identifying with it just to make sense of it. But here's the danger. When you confuse your trauma with your identity, you build your life around your damage. You stop evolving. You protect the wound instead of healing it. To rediscover who you are, you must be willing to strip all that away. To say, this happened to me, yes, but it is not who I am. That statement is a declaration of sovereignty. It's you reclaiming authorship of your life. And in practical terms, that looks like tracking the stories you tell yourself about your worth, your capability, your future. We all have internal narratives. Some are empowering and some are poisonous. I always mess things up. No one ever chooses me. I'm not good enough. These aren't facts. They're scripts, and you have to ask yourself who wrote them? Where did they come from? Whose voice are you echoing when you speak to yourself like that? You have to become the editor of your own psyche, not by denying what's real, but by refusing to let what's painful define you. And that's not just psychology, that's philosophy. Because at the core of this is a question of meaning. If you believe that your life is a random sequence of meaningless events, then sure, there's no reason to revisit the past, no reason to extract value from it. But if you believe that your experiences can be forged into purpose, then everything changes. Then the pain isn't just suffering, it's material. It's the raw input for becoming something more. The philosopher Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." That's the essence of this process. You're not looking back just to remember. You're looking back to refine, to find the thread of meaning that ties it all together and gives direction to the present. You'll notice that the people who seem the most grounded, the most fully themselves, are usually the ones who've wrestled with the most darkness. And they didn't do it by avoiding it. They did it by facing it, naming it, and turning it into fuel. That's what makes someone unshakable, not perfection, integration. And it's not an overnight process. This is slow, deliberate inner engineering. You sit with your past, you reflect, you journal, you go to therapy if you need to, you have difficult conversations, you trace the patterns, you feel the emotions you buried a decade ago, and every time you do, you reclaim a piece of yourself that was trapped in time. The goal isn't to fix the past. You can't. The goal is to transform your relationship with it, to stop running, to stop hiding, to say, I see it, I lived it, and I'm still here, and now I choose who I become. Because when you find the courage to revisit where you lost yourself, that's where you find the clues to who you really are. Not in the performance, not in the projection, but in the parts of you that survived what tried to break you. And when you reclaim those parts, when you no longer flinch at your own story, you become powerful in a way that nothing external can replicate. That's the kind of person the world needs more of. Not someone who's never fallen, but someone who has learned to rise, eyes wide open, past and all. Because you can't change what happened, but you can absolutely change what it means. And that, right there, that's where you begin again. You don't fix your life by fixing everything at once. That's a recipe for collapse. You fix your life by bringing order to one small, concrete thing today. And I don't mean that in a feel-good, motivational sense. I mean that psychologically, neurologically, even philosophically. When everything feels chaotic, when you feel lost, the mind spirals. It tries to grasp onto every problem at once, and in doing so, it paralyzes itself. You can't think clearly when you're overwhelmed, and you certainly can't act effectively. So what's the antidote to chaos? Structure. Not rigid control, but voluntary order. The kind you impose on your own life in small, manageable pieces. Start where you are. Start with what's directly in front of you. That might mean making your bed, organizing your workspace, planning your meals, finally responding to that email you've avoided for 2 weeks. It seems trivial, but it isn't. Those tasks are symbolic. They're you asserting yourself against entropy. You might think, what does making my bed have to do with finding myself? The answer is everything. Because it's not about the bed. It's about reclaiming agency. When your internal world feels out of control, your external world becomes a reflection of that. And likewise, by tidying the outside, you're signaling to your nervous system that you're capable of handling things again. It's a feedback loop. Clean your room and you start to clean your mind. Now, there's a deeper truth hidden in this. Order is not the opposite of chaos, it's the antidote within chaos. Every meaningful transformation starts by imposing structure in the smallest of domains. That's how the psyche stabilizes. That's how you regain momentum. Not by waiting until you feel inspired, but by acting in spite of how uninspired you feel. People lose themselves not just in tragedy, but in drift, in days that blur together, responsibilities that pile up, tasks left incomplete. The subtle erosion of your sense of self often comes not from a dramatic crisis, but from the slow abandonment of responsibility. When you stop choosing what to attend to, the world chooses for you. And the world doesn't care about your peace. It cares about productivity, distraction, addiction, urgency. So if you want to find yourself again, you have to reclaim your attention. That begins by organizing your space. It's not about being neat for the sake of appearances. It's about creating an environment that reflects who you are becoming, not who you've been stuck as. You are sending yourself a message. I matter enough to take care of what's mine. And from that point forward, every small action becomes a vote for who you want to be. People wait for identity to come before action, but it's actually the other way around. Identity is built through action. You don't wake up with clarity and then begin. You begin unclear, uncertain, even doubtful, and you build clarity through repetition, through evidence, through proof that you are capable of following through. It's not just about order for its own sake. It's about building a relationship with yourself based on trust. Because when your life is chaotic, what's really happening is that you've broken trust with yourself. You said you'd do something and didn't. You avoided things you knew you needed to face. And over time, that internal betrayal adds up. It becomes shame, and shame makes people hide from others and from themselves. But when you start showing up for even the smallest responsibilities consistently, you begin to rebuild that relationship. You begin to believe yourself again. You think, if I say I'll do this, maybe I actually will. And that's not just hopeful, that's practical. That's the foundation for self-respect. Now, you don't need to become a perfectionist. That's another trap. People confuse order with rigidity, but real order is dynamic. It adapts. It's not about being militant with your time or turning your life into a color-coded spreadsheet. It's about identifying the minimum effective dose of structure that keeps you grounded. Enough to stabilize you, but not so much that you choke under it. You're not aiming for control, you're aiming for rhythm. Discipline isn't a cage, it's scaffolding. It holds you up while you remember how to stand. And here's what's fascinating. Once you start organizing your outer world, your inner world starts to cooperate. Thoughts become less jumbled. Priorities start to emerge. You begin to sense where your energy should actually go. But you wouldn't get there by thinking your way through the fog. You get there by acting your way out of it. You get there by doing what you can where you are with what you have. Because what you can do today matters more than what you plan to do someday. There's a quiet dignity that comes with ordering your environment, a sense of rootedness, of sovereignty. It tells the world, I take myself seriously, and because I do, you should too. You don't need to change everything. You need to change something, and then let that change compound. So if you're feeling lost, scattered, disconnected, start by organizing one corner of your life. That small act might be the first step in finding the version of you that's been waiting to reemerge, not perfect, not polished, but present. Because in a world that profits from your chaos, structure is a radical act of self-respect. And from that respect, identity begins to rise again. Start with the smallest thing you can control and do it well. That's the path back to yourself. When you've lost yourself, one of the most deceptive lies you begin to believe is that your feelings are facts. That because you feel defeated, you are defeated. Because you feel disconnected, you are no one. But that's not true. That's the emotional brain hijacking your sense of identity. And if you don't challenge that, if you simply accept your emotions as the final truth, you'll be at their mercy for the rest of your life. Now, emotions aren't the enemy. That would be a foolish oversimplification. Emotions are essential. They're messengers, signals from your unconscious that something requires your attention. But the problem arises when we confuse the signal for the self. You are not your anger. You are not your fear. You are not your sadness. You are the person experiencing those emotions. That's a profound psychological distinction. And that distinction between what you feel and who you are is what separates those who stay stuck from those who start to climb. Because the person who identifies with the emotion becomes reactive. They spiral, they withdraw, they numb. But the person who observes the emotion can begin to investigate it. They can ask, where is this coming from? What's underneath it? What story am I telling myself right now? And is it actually true? Most people never ask that, they just ride the wave. But the wave doesn't care if it drags you into self-doubt, shame, or paralysis. It will keep crashing and taking you with it. Until you realize, you're not the water, you're the observer. You're the one who can stand still in the middle of the storm and think, all right, I feel this, but I don't have to become this. That's where emotional regulation begins, not with suppression, but with awareness. And from awareness, we move toward discipline. Not the cold, rigid kind that suppresses all feeling, but the kind that says, despite how I feel, I still choose my actions. That's maturity. That's strength. That's how you rebuild your identity, through chosen responses, not unconscious reactions. But emotional discipline isn't something you just wake up with. It's cultivated slowly. Deliberately. You start by identifying your most common emotional triggers, the moments that send you spiraling. Maybe it's being criticized, feeling ignored, experiencing failure, or being reminded of past trauma. These are patterns, and they're not random. They're reflections of deeper wounds, and they show up to be healed, not to punish you. Once you know your patterns, you can predict your emotional traps. And once you can predict them, you can prepare for them. That's a psychological skill most people never learn. They think healing means never never feeling bad again. No, healing means knowing exactly what to do when you feel bad. It means having strategies, mental frameworks, breathing techniques, grounding exercises, boundaries that keep you anchored when the wave rises again. Because it will rise. That's life. No one escapes pain. No one avoids frustration or betrayal or uncertainty. But the people who rise, who find themselves again, are the ones who learn how to feel without crumbling. They learn to take a breath between stimulus and response. And in that breath, in that pause, there's freedom. There's a moment to remember who you are, not what the world says you are, not what your past says you are, but who you choose to be in this exact moment. And that's power. That's real agency, not the illusion of control over everything around you, but the undeniable control over how you carry yourself through it. That's what smart people do. That's what grounded people do. They don't deny their emotions, but they also don't hand over the keys to their identity every time a feeling shows up at the door. You can tell a lot about someone by how they act when they're angry, when they're rejected, when they're afraid. Do they lash out? Do they shut down? Do they sabotage everything? Or do they take a moment, breathe deeply, and respond with clarity, even if it hurts? Emotional maturity isn't about becoming stoic or robotic. It's about becoming integrated, where your emotions inform you but don't define you, where you have space between your feeling and your behavior. That space is where growth happens. That space is where you begin to find yourself again. So if you've lost yourself and you're trying to reclaim your identity, start by reclaiming your responses. Don't let your emotions run your life like a tyrant. Let them speak, but don't let them rule. You are not a puppet pulled by every passing mood. You are a conscious being with the capacity to think, to reflect, and to act deliberately. In a culture that tells you to just feel your way through life, I'll tell you something different. Feel, yes, but think too. Think deeply, act with precision. Choose your next step not out of emotion, but out of principle. That's how you reclaim your power. That's how you find yourself again, not by being emotionless, but by being emotionally sovereign. And in that sovereignty, you'll discover something remarkable, that the version of you you've been trying to find was never lost. It was buried under unexamined feelings, waiting, watching, and ready to rise. Because emotional self-mastery is not repression, it's revelation. It's the path through which you meet yourself clearly, courageously, and consciously. Most people spend their lives avoiding solitude because they've confused it with loneliness. They think being alone means being abandoned, unwanted, or irrelevant. But that's not solitude, that's isolation. And there's a crucial difference. Solitude is chosen, it's deliberate, and in its truest form, it's one of the most powerful tools for rediscovering who you are. See, we live in a world that never stops talking, never stops pulling social media, news feeds, texts, opinions, constant noise, all of it keeping your attention hostage. It's not accidental. It's engineered that way. And over time, if you don't carve out space for yourself, you become a stranger to your own soul. You become reactive, scattered, anxious, because your mind is saturated with the perspectives of everyone except your own. So let's cut straight to it. If you've lost yourself and you're trying to find your way back, the first place you need to look isn't outward. It's inward. And the only way to get there, the only real way, is to be still long enough to hear your own voice beneath the noise. Now that's not easy, and many people avoid it because they don't like what they hear in the quiet. Regret, guilt, insecurity, it all bubbles to the surface when there are no distractions. But here's the thing, the discomfort you feel in solitude isn't a punishment, it's the truth trying to talk to you. And if you lean into it, if you stop running from it, it has the potential to heal you. There's a reason ancient philosophers, prophets, and sages sought solitude, not because they were antisocial, but because they understood something most people forget. Transformation begins in silence, it begins in the wilderness, when the voices of others finally fade, and all that's left is you. And in that space, if you're courageous enough to remain, you start to separate the noise from the signal. You begin to see clearly. You begin to remember. But solitude isn't just about being alone. It's about what you do in that aloneness. Are you scrolling and numbing, or are you listening, reflecting, and writing down what emerges? One of the most practical things you can do is sit down with a journal and ask hard questions. What am I pretending not to know? Where did I abandon myself? What values have I compromised? Who am I trying to impress, and why? These aren't casual questions. They're excavations. And if you dig deep enough, you'll hit bedrock, the foundation of who you are. What you'll find isn't always pleasant. You might confront patterns of self-betrayal. You might realize how often you've performed for approval, how much you've given away your power just to keep the peace. But here's the paradox. Facing those truths is exactly what sets you free. Because once you see the machinery of your own self-deception, you can stop it. You can intervene. You can begin again, not as a persona, but as a person. And this is where things start to shift. Because solitude, properly engaged, doesn't make you weaker or more isolated. It makes you sharper. It clarifies your mind. It strengthens your convictions. It reconnects you to something immovable, something you can stand on when everything else feels unstable. Think of it this way. If you don't know how to be with yourself, you'll always need someone else to validate your worth. And that's a dangerous place to live. That dependency breeds anxiety, manipulation, resentment. But if you've faced yourself truly, deeply, then you can walk into any room without needing to be liked. You're not looking for approval. You're not seeking permission. You are yourself, unapologetically. That's power. That's peace. And let's not romanticize this either. Solitude isn't always serene. Sometimes it's brutal. You'll wrestle with your shadow. You'll feel lost before you feel found. But if you stay with it, if you keep showing up to that quiet space, you'll start to sense something ancient inside you, a kind of wisdom that doesn't come from books or podcasts or likes or applause. It comes from direct encounter with your own soul. And that encounter changes everything. It gives you discernment, so you're no longer tossed around by trends, emotions, or opinions. It gives you direction because you start to hear your own inner compass. And perhaps most importantly, it gives you dignity, the unshakable sense that your value isn't up for negotiation. You're not just playing a role anymore. You're not trying to win a game you didn't even choose to play. You're living from the inside out. So if you've lost yourself, start here. Choose solitude, not to escape the world, but to return to it whole. Not to wall yourself off, but to meet yourself fully. Because the moment you truly encounter yourself in the silence, you stop looking to the world to tell you who you are. And that's the turning point. Because when you know yourself, when you remember yourself, you become dangerous to everything that ever tried to make you small. You become untouchable in a way that has nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with alignment. The person who is at peace with themselves cannot be controlled. And that's why solitude, real solitude, is not weakness, it's rebellion, it's revolution. It's the birthplace of self-respect. So take the time, turn off the noise, sit with yourself long enough to remember who you are, and then rise.